Otomo Kazuhiro's renowned manga series Akira follows Kaneda, the leader of a teenage biker gang living in a dystopian future city called Neo-Tokyo. Neo-Tokyo is defined by a mysterious explosion of massive power that occurred years prior and the fascistic response its government issued in its wake. It's a place filled with massive inequality, where the military has the highest political power, whose youth are viewed as a lost generation not worth the effort. Kaneda is no angel, but he's also a product of his environment. It's hard to look at the dilapidated neighborhood he lives in and question why he'd choose to run wild rather than follow the predetermined career path his teachers try to beat him into submission over. Of course, the young rebel without a cause is soon thrown into a conflict between a genuine rebellion, the military, and his former friend Tetsuo, now imbued with a psychokinetic power from someone or something named Akira. Kaneda doesn't fully understand the politics of the rebellion. He hasn't read Marx, he doesn't spit soliloquies about revolution, he only takes interest in the first place because he's attracted to a member named Kei. But as he helps her take on cops and soldiers, which he's already firmly opposed to, he begins to see the larger scope of this conflict. Of course, that's partially forced upon him because Tetsuo is an ever-strengthening conduit for Akira's power, and soon eliminates every biker gang. But after Kaneda becomes privy to the cosmic forces at play, killing Tetsuo isn't just about avenging his friends. Pretty soon, and this is actually where the manga goes so much further than the film, a second blast marking the return of Akira upends everything. In the wake of this explosion, Neo-Tokyo is separated into new territories, with Tetsuo's becoming the most aggressive faction in a battle for control. The military tries and fails to put its absurd weaponry to use, and their attempts to understand and contain the power of Akira is all for naught. This is because Akira the boy is a mere shell of a body with a direct link to the source of the universe. Its power is boundless energy. Even as Tetsuo amasses more power, striving to transcend beyond Akira, he fails to see that there's no mastery of this cosmic energy in its totality, and he begins to lose his physical form. The series isn't a direct manifesto for overthrowing capitalism and martial law. It's messy, its protagonist doesn't move with a ton of forethought, and he isn't a paragon of virtue. He's a punk-ass kid who doesn't respect authority or the crumbling societal structures he was raised in, and that alignment eventually drives him to take part in a bigger liberation effort. Akira ends with a Neo-Tokyo that has survived a second blast, and rejects the government that came before. It's a new world, led by a new generation. They're forever changed by the havoc wrought by powers beyond their control, but they can rebuild. They face the supposed end of the world that people believe will come before the end of capitalism. And they're still standing. Cyberpunk is a science fiction subgenre featuring a near-future world suffering from the effects of late capitalism, typically focusing on people's relationship to technology and a dehumanization of the self. The creators of these works probably wouldn't have used the term late capitalism, but their images of worlds strangled by modernization and corporate control are quite identical. They're often depicted as heavily polluted, overpopulated, suffering from severe wealth inequality, ruled by militaristic fascist governments, commodified at every turn, and blurring the line between man and machine. They feature an exaggerated and frightening, but not quite implausible level of technology, less space stations, more neighborhoods choked out by the fumes of the android slave factory. It's the sequel to the industrial age's fears of the mechanization of the human body. If Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times was moved underground and rather than tiptoeing its way into sound was bombarded with non-stop noise and no-knock warrants. And therein lies the punk part. It's not just about how cool this mechanical arm looks, it's the corporate oligarchy is going to suffocate us with noxious pollutants unless we do something drastic. Because obviously, without institutional change, cybernetics will be invested in for their boost of productivity rather than quality of life. However, the cyborg aesthetic, in which body modification is commonplace, is one where the traditional notions of body standards are so completely irrelevant. And that has an obvious appeal for trans and disabled viewers. And let's be honest, cyborg shit can just be cool to look at. Grimy urban settings drenched in fog and neon, imaginative weapons and vehicle designs that look functional in the real world, ragtag factions, and action enhanced by robotics. Pretty no-nonsense stuff there. Cyberpunk is cool, even though its narratives invoke despair. As such, several years after its golden era, when Akira has long ascended from cult status to Kanye West videos, it's become too much of a cultural touchstone to resist reviving. But like with most products of the 30-year culture cycle, new additions are frequently nostalgia-baiting duds. And it's in this sad streak of media that we find a genre so uniquely displaying the issues of the film industry today. What I'm referring to henceforth as neoliberalism. A visual language that unmistakably critiques capitalism being used as set dressing for films that emblemize the soullessness of the franchise factory. Cyberpunk picks up during the neoliberal end goal, so it's only right that they try to sell this imagery back to us as alt-pop. For better or worse, it's worth noting how the back and forth between Japanese and American media informs the genre. Cyberpunk emerged in response to the explosion of digital technology. The United States was of course already an economic powerhouse and colonial entity, making its stake in technological developments quite natural. Japan was uniquely positioned to comment on this growing sense of technophobia due to the country asserting itself as a leader in the tech race. Sony, Panasonic, Toshiba, JVC, Sharp, these companies developed the first transistor radios, VHS recorders, mass-produced laptops. As their brand names became near ubiquitous, there came this fear that Japan, or entities based in Japan, would come to dominate the world market. Therefore, as we currently see with American rhetoric about the People's Republic of China, the desire to posit Japan as a looming threat became tied to conversations about the nation's technological innovations. Factor in the national resentment toward Japan for its role in World War II, and by the rise of Japanese tech companies, the very same generation who framed them as enemies years prior is obviously going to perceive the nation's return to a form of power as worrying. That's not to detract from the very long history of Japan as an imperial power itself. Though the nation has been victim to atrocities, it's also responsible for inflicting many of them. But, of course, antagonism toward the so-called Eastern world has a storied past. Orientalism, the exoticization and generalization of a mass of land east of Europe to other groups of people, was a primary element of the dependence on those regions for trade goods, as well as a desire for control of said resources. The other side of this coin is a long history of European fascination with a culture they perceive as so different from their own. Europeans first arrived in Japan in 1543, with Portugal dominating the trade market up until the period in which Japan closed itself off from foreigners aside from Dutch traders. During this period, what art and supplies carried over from the Dutch, such as the famed woodblock prints of the Edo period, acquired additional interest in their limited supply. Upon the reopening of Japan in 1853, a decision informed by pressure from a squadron of US warships, the rediscovery of Japanese art and culture became a sensation. A sensation so large that in France it was given the name Japonisme. There was a lot of shit in the vein of a voyeuristic painting of a South Asian street market, but the technique grafted from East Asia influenced some very significant works, namely in contributing to Impressionism. Take for example Van Gogh's irises, a simple, evocative expression of nature. No human subject, no Judeo-Christian or Greco-Roman imagery, defiant of photorealism. It even bears resemblance to a Japanese motif to depict a bridge surrounded by irises in reference to a scene in the Ise stories. Does this mean Van Gogh was a sick little weeb who would have used 4chan? Perhaps a definitive answer exists, but JSTOR isn't free to the public. Still, it does give us an idea of how affecting and far back the fascination with Japan goes, as well as Japan's abusive relationship to the West. Japan's reopening coincided with an attempt to westernize, and the presence of Western powers also brought new technologies and cultural practices. Christianity, neckties, gunpowder, the Roman alphabet, crimes against humanity. The exchange continued and shifted through the years, and filmmaking, an art form uniquely seated in the intersection of technology and the interests of established wealth, was bound to express these sentiments. Blade Runner, directed by Ridley Scott, released in 1982, famously speaks to this era. It can be criticized for a much exoticized portrayal of East Asian imagery. Asian people and languages are set dressing, while the technophobic elements of the film draw a line to xenophobia. But an image of the future populated by Japanese and Chinese corporations, as well as American ones, was well founded. Furthermore, Blade Runner spoke to Japanese audiences as much as it did Americans, After all, a rapidly urbanized, hyper-capitalist future dominated by a small group of companies from various economic powerhouses also reflected their concerns. And as provisions written by the United States were added to Japan's constitution after their surrender in World War II, provisions which still leave Japan dependent on the United States for military and trade functions, a blurry line between both nations' governments and their private sectors, isn't an unheard of anxiety for Japanese citizens. Japan, like the Republic of Korea, is a nation that takes orders from the US in many regards, is made economically dependent on the US, and serves as a key site for the US to maintain military presence around its non-allied neighbors, namely the People's Republic of China and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Another cultural connection between Japan and the United States is the period of economic downturn that followed this era of unregulated expansion. Just as trickle-down theory afforded damages to working conditions and the distribution of wealth that have yet to be undone, the bubble in Japan burst just before a massive portion of the population would reach the age range to seek employment. Due to the severely diminished amount of available jobs amidst a record-high number of applicants, this demographic came to be known as the lost generation. And because of age discrimination, the increased likelihood that companies hire recent graduates over older workers, and the limited opportunities for promotion, this is a term that's still in use today. Factor in the recurring bribery scandals among Japan's political establishment, and it's quite obvious why this period would be marked by countercultural trends, disillusionment, and increased rates of suicide. Thus, Blade Runner's hellscape LA, overrun with faceless multinational corporations and dehumanizing living conditions, struck a chord with Japanese creators as well. This was their future too, and a fear of Japanese tech isn't necessarily off topic for somebody shackled to a cubicle within one of those companies. This is perhaps best evidenced by the work of Watanabe Shinichiro, the creator of Cowboy Bebop. Cowboy Bebop, a noirish anime series about a small group of bounty hunters navigating their tragedy-stricken lives in an expansive but often derelict interplanetary society, was stated to be inspired by Blade Runner. It wears its fascination with noir, westerns, and jazz on its sleeve, and though it explores far-reaching corners of its galaxy, the impression of Deckard's Los Angeles is tangible. Watanabe has had multiple series that operate within this world, exploring different genres and tones, but easily operating with the massive society he's constructed. But his impact on cyberpunk reverberated back to Blade Runner, when he was given the opportunity to direct the animated short film Blade Runner Blackout 2022, which alongside two other films acts as a supplementary prequel to Blade Runner 2049. By the way, the marketing of these shorts sucked, so if you haven't heard of this, definitely watch it. And Watanabe, who is still working today, has already had so big of an impact with Cowboy Bebop that American filmmakers have long been vocal about that series being an inspiration to them.
You bitch! 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 About bitch!
His work stands as a prime example of art, and especially cyberpunk, that's part of a continuum. It's a genre whose influence has become difficult to trace because it's seeped into various other works and broader genres altogether, and it continues to evolve in cross-cultural dialogue. An unfortunate consequence of this exchange is that the genre is now a content pool for cash grab media. It's an established aesthetic which can be accessed for nostalgia or used as shorthand to imply depth without presenting new ideas. And so Cyberpunk 2 has entered the remake apocalypse. Ghost in the Shell 1995, directed by Oshimamoru, is an anime film about a special unit of federal law enforcement made up of cyborg soldiers, referred to as Section 9. The protagonist, Major Motoko Kusanagi, is essentially a paramilitary asset whose body is so composed of synthetic material that only her partially damaged organic brain remains. The ghost in the shell refers to the person within a given full-body prosthesis. However, the presence of cyberbrains gives way to a new level of hacking, and when a cyberbrain hacker of unprecedented ability, known as the Puppet Master, enters the scene, they enact a plan to infiltrate Section 9 headquarters, at which point it's revealed that the Puppet Master is an AI created by Government Division Section 6, now loose from their control and requesting recognition as a living organism. Rather than return the Puppet Master into Section 9 custody, Kusanagi interfaces with them, at which point the Puppet Master makes a plea to merge and become a new life form, completing their desire to become a full-fledged living being. Obviously, I'm mentioning this film because it was remade into a much criticized live-action American film in 2017, a film whose failures quite blatantly demonstrate the idea of neoliberalism. Like all American remakes of anime, it was met with vocal skepticism from fans, thought of as a completely unnecessary production from the outset. And as further details emerged, Ghost 2017 was very apparently westernizing the story of the highly regarded film, which so many viewers regarded as distinctly Japanese. On top of that, the marketing, as American movies are wont to do, was heavily focused on the lead actress, Scarlett Johansson, a white woman occupying the role of an Asian character. This aspect of the film was highly debated as kind of a last straw to the Hollywood tradition of whitewashing, and Johansson would shortly after receive backlash for being cast to play a trans woman as well, solidifying a cultural perception of her as a serial offender of the desire for equal opportunity for minorities in film. I think an adaptation of a story that comments on another country's socio-political structure isn't inherently bad. A good adaptation would seek to use the ideas present in its source material and reapply them to new contexts. And as I've just been talking about, a dialogue between Japanese and American cyberpunk is a long-standing component of the most famous entries. Ghost in the Shell 95 is itself an adaptation of a manga, which is tonally and artistically quite different. The manga can be much more lighthearted, its art style is further from photorealism, and its kusanagi is livelier and more playful. Oshii in general has a reputation for making existential films with chunks of philosophical dialogue. As such, his world and protagonists are colder, more detached versions of themselves. His version of the Major is somebody whose maturity far exceeds her eternally youthful image, clinical in even the tensest shootouts, but seeking affirmation of her humanity when everything but her organic brain is government property. For Kusanagi, somebody who has lived in prostheses for the majority of her life, she's long departed the ship of Theseus. Thus, the film sees her surpass these questions entirely to ascend toward transhumanism, giving birth to an entirely new type of organism through synthetic means. Her partner Bato, in contrast, clings more to humanity despite appearing more robotic. When the Major voices her doubts of having a true self or deriving pleasure from the threat of death in deep-sea diving, he's resistant.
電脳と擬態によってより高度な能力の獲得を追求した挙句、最高度のメンテナンスなしには生存できなくなったとしても文句を言う筋合いじゃないわ。
俺たちは休暇に魂まで売っちまったわけじゃないんだぜ。
He's a bit more impulsive and he even smiles more. He's eventually accepting of the Major's decision to merge with the Puppet Master, going out of his way to give her offspring a new black market body. But when first hearing the Puppet Master's plan, he is frightened. The political turmoil behind the plot is also an international affair. The conflict kicks off with the assassination of a foreign diplomat offering asylum to a government programmer. We later learn the Puppet Master was developed for espionage by the US, and when Section 6's role in this mess becomes apparent, the director of Section 9 orders the Puppet Master be killed if not acquired as a bargaining chip. Kusanagi defies orders to talk with them, but the ultimate outcome of the conflict between Sections 6 and 9 is nothing. They both cut their losses, assuming both Kusanagi and Puppet Master neutralize, and the events are covered up. No singular villain is revealed or dealt with, and the public is none the wiser. These militarized divisions just call it a stalemate and return to business as usual. Ghost in the Shell 2017 is a Hollywood action movie. As such, it adopts a much more simplistic plot. Rather than a disillusioned cyborg with a vague sense of personhood, Major Myra Killian is going through a RoboCop situation. She is the first known person composed entirely of cybernetics, developed by a private military contractor to be a federal operative. She has no recollection of her past life before being rebuilt, which she pines to learn. The character is reworked to be more compelling. The dialogue is infinitely more obvious.
You're not the same. Hey.
The tone is more familiar and the leads are all white. The plot's much the same. The Major is part of a federal task force pursuing cyber hackers. Kuze, filling the role of the Puppet Master, flies into their radar by hacking into robots and other cyber brains, eventually revealing to the Major that he's a discarded predecessor of hers, at which point she defies her CEO to help Kuze upload his consciousness. Section 9 operatives are targeted by the company, leading to the Major battling a tank remote controlled by the CEO himself, and her commanding officer gets to shoot him into a pond, wrapping everything up in a nice little bow. However, this time the Major doesn't merge with Kuze or abandon her shell. She just goes back to being an agent now that the real bad guy is out of the picture. It's become a good cop rising above corruption structure action movie. No idea is substantially explored, and the critical implications toward privatized military, policing, and the surveillance state are softened. The film is designed to be palatable to the widest possible audience, wearing the skin of a progressively minded story while dulling its themes to say,
"Gee, corporations can be pretty bad. We can't take away cops' ability to self-govern because they're the good guys."
And yet, the film upholds this ideology in the most generic manner possible. For all its expositional dialogue, it doesn't even have characters express any particular beliefs about power structures or the cyber hackers they pursue. Even as the Major loudly mopes about feeling non-human, every single character impassionately reassures her that she is in fact a person, her coworkers, her boss, even the scientist who engineered her.
We cling to memories as if they define us, but they really don't. What we do is what defines us.
The only person to deny her humanity is the CEO of the weapons company, who very flatly says he sees her as a product. And sure, CEOs are supervillains, I agree, but the utter forcefulness of the movie could have been smoothed out by more nuanced or conflict-driven interactions. Instead, the dialogue is ham-fisted, with characters racing to ask Philosophy 100 discussion questions.
You're what everyone will become one day. You don't know how alone that makes me feel.
My people embrace cyber enhancement, as do I. There's no one who really understands the risk to individuality, identity, messing with the human soul.
Every single day I get screwed by my memories. It's better to be pure. Like you.
She'd write her manifestos about how technology was destroying the world.
It looks quite nice, but leans far too heavily on the imagery of the original. And its characters, despite being written to be more emotive, have even less personality than their animated counterparts. I went into this movie questioning whether my disinterest in Scarlett Johansson, the actress, was solely the result of disliking her public persona. But she's bad in this, only ever lifeless or melodramatic, sometimes seemingly decided by a coin toss. The dialogue isn't doing her any favors, sure, but she displays neither convincing emotions nor mysterious disaffectedness. She reads like the obligatory star power hire who has no creative investment in yet another secret agent role with a big paycheck. There is an essay yet to be written about how Ryan Gosling's indie resume culminated in him playing an android who dreams of being a real boy in Denis Villeneuve's Blade Runner sequel, while Johansson's MCU contract led her to sleepwalk through a role as a cyborg soldier who wishes she remembered her childhood in a forgettable remake of an animated film. Some bones are thrown with Chin Han as Togasa, the only member of Section 9 with 0 cyber mods, and prolific Japanese actor-director Beat Takeshi Kitano as Chief Aramaki. But neither are actually main characters. Perhaps the most egregious offense is the whitewashing of the character now being an actual plot event. By that, I mean that when the Major discovers her past life, she finds that she was a Japanese-American activist who fled to a lawless zone and protested the direction of cybernetics. Her real name? Motoko Kusanagi. We don't physically see her old face, but she finds her mother, who's played by Japanese actress Momo Ikaori. I hope this was in the script before the controversy, rather than in response, because I actually find this more offensive, since it acknowledges the race change to the viewer, but doesn't explore this idea in any way. It's actually not mentioned at all in the movie, not the implications of a private company designing their new product to be a conventionally attractive white woman after extracting her brain from an Asian woman living in an anarchist commune, nor does it imply that modifying one's appearance to fit the hegemony might become part of a society where people acquire entirely new bodies. And those are actually new ideas, tailored more specifically to American culture, that could have been injected into the existing story. Rather, this is a bare minimum deflection from whitewashing to reassure us that the character is actually Asian while still not addressing the real issue. And if you are being further obtuse and adding that we only see Motoko's mother and she thus could be half white, it still stands to reason that they could have cast a biracial actress. Again, the idea of a post-racial future where communities are so diverse that it's common for immediate family members to present radically different phenotypes is a potentially new element which is in fact a feature of many communities across the Americas. It also happens all over the world because children descending from different ethnic groups have always existed, but if cultural integration is a distinct feature of your future aesthetic, a broadly diverse cast would do wonders to depict this. On the same note, the only indication of trans identity in the movie comes in the form of a comic relief scene where Bato is shocked to see a feminine-looking person using the urinal next to him. So basically, a man so accustomed to body modification that his coworker got a synthetic liver to overcome cirrhosis rather than go to an AA meeting is somehow surprised by the sight of somebody trans feminine, something that already exists today. In Ghost in the Shell 95, the puppet master is explicitly called sexless. After all, how could an AI be gendered? They inhabit a female body and are voiced by a male actor. In 2017, the extent of expanding on Kuze's identity is to reveal his given name was Hideo and imply he and Motoko were a couple. This is done because American movies have to have romance, I guess. And he uploads himself before asking too many questions. The film simply ambles down a list of checkboxes labeled themes mentioned and visuals from the original and calls it a day. It is unmemorable and exists only to be a product. This is what it means to lack artistic integrity. More than being a bad movie, Ghost in the Shell 2017 is emblematic of the entertainment industry's current approach to the cyberpunk genre as a content mine. It's full of intellectual property with a dedicated cult following, and if new entries in these titles can be made, regardless of how good they are, they'll certainly generate a profit. A genre that was once quite radical is now at the stage that it's worn as an aesthetic to mask the same old garbage. And obviously, this is only one instance of a larger inevitability. Cinema as a product will always interfere with cinema as an art form. A filmmaker must attempt to balance their creative desires with marketability. And under this status quo, the capitalist's desires to risk as little as possible for a guaranteed turnout will always prevail. If you consider yourself a leftist, you may already be aware that that ideology is not supported by the film industry. The root of this problem is obviously that film production is a grossly capitalist enterprise largely dominated by just 5 media conglomerates. And as is true with any art chained to commerce, there will be dissonance between fiction as a product and an authorial conviction to the eradication of this system, as long as it's published within it. If an artwork is just another product in one of the most profitable marketplaces lorded over by the ruling class, creators will always have to be mindful of their work's need to sell. We often talk about this with the make one for me, make one for them line of thinking, wherein filmmakers juggle a passion project after a more commercially oriented blockbuster, or perhaps in celebrating those standout films that have more progressive messaging. Part of the joy is the knowledge that this is a rare victory to actually make something on the mark without like a Weinstein company sweeping in to recut it. But it's also a plain truth we should accept that most creatives in Hollywood are rather conservative as it is. Film and TV are nasty industries. We know how frequent it is that disgusting rich people come into high positions of power there and the kind of damage they inflict. And we know that the majority of people with power or success in the industry are wealthy white men born into wealth and privilege. But any minority who rises through the ranks and becomes wealthy is just another class enemy. Most of the prominent members of underrepresented communities there are born to great privilege as it is. The conclusion to draw from all this is not to engage in socio-political nihilism. I think lying down and saying, well, they're all in control anyway, is pretty much the same as apathy. I just want to be able to talk about the industry from a more concrete understanding of how it operates. I think that we're often persuaded to overstate the impact of films. Art is important, and it certainly can leave an impression on people ideologically as well as emotionally. But the belief that it's a primary method of progress is a narrative that benefits the powers that be. To turn your values into a product, to sell the image of change rather than actually produce it, to placate you with shallow markers of improvement. It's more likely that films under capitalism are able to speak to values that run contrary to that system in broad strokes. Again, there are exceptions, but even Squid Game doesn't say it's about capitalism in plain dialogue. And seemingly every rich person who saw Parasite has no idea how to read it, so I mean, there's also their cognitive dissonance that helps carry such films through. I think there are reasons to tell stories that are critical of politicians, the wealthy, the government, whiteness, patriarchy, heteronormativity, etc., even if it's just a kind of relief to visit a narrative where the status quo is disrupted. But this isn't going to be equivalent to activism, and it's always going to be worth keeping a critical eye on films that want to tap into these conversations. I love to see sci-fi draw on the look, feel, and ideas of classics like Akira. I think there's plenty of good art to be made from its genes. I just don't know how to make peace with the fact that a tech bro might feel just as attached to these properties as I do, and for completely different reasons.
Hey Benton, don't crap your pants if you see a vampire out there.
Get lost. You wouldn't recognize a goddamn vampire if one jumped up and bit you on the end of your fucking dick. So just get off my back.